A minister new to Boston, Massachusetts, asked his congregation to name the single hardest time they had suffered as a church. Since Boston is a port city, he expected them to talk about changes that had swept over the church as immigrant groups arrived and changed the nature of their city. Or, he thought, perhaps people would refer back to their early history and talk about their experiences during the Revolutionary War. As the minister later learned, the British had burned the church in 1774 and had shot and killed the then minister's wife. But alas, none of these possibilities topped the list. The congregation said that the hardest time came in 1843 when the pastor of the day persuaded members of the congregation to give away their homes and their farms, to don long white robes, and to wait on the hilltop for Jesus. Many people did, and they waited a long time. Finally, after many hours, they went home, and shame-faced, they asked for their property to be returned. True story. Now, we may laugh at their naivete, but there's something about the idea that God will soon step in to end the world that continues to intrigue us even today. Right? Just consider how popular the Left Behind series of books and the subsequent movie were. Remember them? Today, folk see signs of the coming apocalypse in global warming or in the hellfire of the Middle East. Earlier generations found it in the Soviet Empire or in the bubonic plague of medieval times. In Jesus and Paul's day, in the passage that Doug just read, people found signs of the apocalypse in the brutality of the Roman Empire. In other words, for every generation, signs of the end times are not hard to spot if you're determined to find them. But Paul stressed the nearness of the day of the Lord. A day when the righteous would be judged worthy and they'd be gathered up to meet the Lord on his coming again. Paul stressed the nearness of that day and the nearness of people's salvation from Rome. He stressed that nearness. This was his plan. He stressed that nearness in order to keep people's hope alive, given the hardship and the persecution that they were facing. But for Paul, the day of the Lord was still only near. It had not yet arrived, as others were preaching, as Doug mentioned in his introduction to the passage. Paul writes, "Do not let anyone deceive you in any way, for the day will not come until the final rebellion takes place and the wicked one appears, who is destined to hell. He will oppose every so-called God or object of worship and will put himself above them all. He will even go in and sit down in God's temple and claim to be God." Now, we could spend hours days, even years perhaps, trying to decipher the precise events described in Paul's letter. People have. We could try to figure out precisely the identity of the wicked one and the nature of the cosmic and apocalyptic struggle to come. We could then try to link verses in the passage with certain contemporary events so as to predict the date of that struggle and the final end, and many people have. Then we could all sell our homes and farms. We could don long white robes, find a hilltop, if there is one in Essex County, and wait for Jesus. Right? But maybe I shouldn't joke about this. For I wouldn't want to downplay the theological significance of the cosmic forces that Paul alludes to in this text. I have to be careful. One of my favorite authors, Walter Wink, he argues that because most of us no longer believe in creatures like Satan or the wicked one, we tend to dismiss them as unimportant. And yet these creatures remind us that catastrophe and evil are very real, even if we no longer personify them. People in the time of Jesus and Paul took a host of what we call principalities and powers to be quite real. Wink writes, what the ancients called spirits or angels or demons were actual entities, only they didn't hover in the air. They were incarnate. Right? As God was incarnate in Jesus. Incarnate. They were incarnate in cellulose, in cement, or skin and bone, or an empire and its mercenary armies. The spirits were incarnate in all of these. Wink suggests that today, and this is interesting, we might reinterpret those biblical spirits as inhabiting institutions, nation states, regimes, economic systems, and any and all other entities that exert power over our lives. What do you think of that? So we might reinterpret the wicked one as a spirit of extreme arrogance, embodied in anyone or anything that claims to be godlike, but is really anti-God. Anyone or anything that prevents us from coming into the near presence of God. Sunday morning hockey comes to mind. But let's get back to thinking about the end times and about God stepping in to end the world. What's its appeal, I wonder? Surely it varies. For some people, I know, it's a matter of one-upmanship that comes from knowing things that others don't. I know the date, you don't. For others, the idea that the world will end and that they will be among those who are saved, it's a wonderful escape from a difficult situation. I can see that. It may be bad down here, but just wait. I'm going to don my long white robe, and I'm going to walk those golden streets. I can see that. Whatever draws us to think about the end of the world, the day of the Lord, the second coming of Christ, call it any of these. The theme is consistent throughout the Bible, if you read it from cover to cover. The Old Testament prophets, wow, they look forward to the day. Jesus himself saw his own ministry as leading toward that day. And his followers, well, we all know, they eagerly awaited his return. So the theme goes throughout. Everyone is waiting for some kind of payback. The time when God rises up and finally says, enough. I pray that someday that will happen. I do. I pray that one day evil will lose its power in the world. I pray for that every day. I pray for the day when sin and injustice, sickness and despair, why even death itself will end. I pray for that every day. It's the most vital promise to which I cling. So what is the right way to live for tomorrow? Do you don your long white robe and sit on the hill to wait? Apparently that was the thinking of the early church in Thessalonica. Folks were so sure that the big event was right around the corner that they quit working and moved to full-time waiting. Paul has to tell them that it could be a long wait. What we need to know ourselves in the 21st century is that even Jesus himself didn't know when the day of the Lord would come. So, rather than speculate about the who and the when of Christ's return, here's what I think. What we ought to do in the interim is tend to our own souls. Rather than try to identify the wicked one, we need to recognize our own tendency to play that role. We have to be honest with ourselves. We can also commit to live in a way that thwarts the wicked one's every move. We have that choice. We can work for justice and peace in the world, even during times of discouragement. We can do that. We can seek out and neutralize evil powers that can inhabit institutions and nation states and regimes and economic systems and anything else that has a negative influence on our lives. We can do that. We can do that. The promise is that evil will be defeated. Evil will not rule the world forever. That's the promise. For me, as I hope for you, that promise is at once comforting, hopeful, and still challenging. I don't want you to be discouraged as you work for justice. When the going is slow, when the going is tough. There will be times, there are times, when evil seems to hold too much power. But if we cling to the hope that evil's power is limited, that evil will not have the final say. You've got to believe that. It's our hope. Because without that hope, we can't continue the struggle. Knowing that God's favor will fall on those who do feed the hungry, who visit the sick and the imprisoned, and clothe the naked. That can sustain us in the hard times. The story's told that one day back in early Puritan New England, there was a major eclipse. The sun was blotted out. The day turned dark, almost black. People were terrified. The world is going to end. What shall we do? The people cried out. And one insightful man replied, "Why, let us be found doing our duty." Let us be found doing our duty. That's our faith. That's our pledge. That's our commitment as followers of the Christ. Can we sing hymn number 660? And we'll sing verses 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the hymn, How Firm a Foundation, 660.